Aloha, welcome to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster. We're going to discuss for part 2 of China's Navy and the People's Liberation Army Navy. And I'm so glad to have you back on the show, Carl.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
So 2 weeks ago, we finished the conversation, and we were discussing China's 2 main focuses when it comes to developing their Navy. So it's sea denial and pure modernization. Let's start talking about that and reviewing that a little bit.
Okay, well, first, the modernization is something they had to do because most of their fleet was completely obsolete. They were using technology from the 50s as late as the mid-70s, and so what you've seen is a series of incremental improvements. And once that modernization is nearing fruition, which is what we see today, they've then begun to implement their strategic focus, and that has 2 elements to it as well. For example, one is the sea denial, area denial mission, which we see here on map 1. As you can see, the first island chain covers much of what's been in the news lately, where they talk about their South China Sea claims. And it also goes out to all the narrow seaways and entryways to what China considers its critical near waters. China's historical view is that the 19th century, they were taken over by a force that came in from an area they traditionally ignored, the ocean. So much of their national security concerns is driven by that history. Like every other country and culture, they're very much prisoners of their past. Now, as they look down the future, they have what they call the view of the second island chain, which they hope to be able to dominate by the year 2030. Some say 2050. And you can see it's much further out. And the goal there is to prevent longer range threats from being able to reach the Chinese mainland. And much of their technology is driven to operate and dominate and deny those areas to a potential threat. For example, they now have what they call the DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile, which is the range of which is depicted by the solid dash line you see there on the map. You'll notice it reaches out across much of the Philippines and just beyond the first island chain. We now have reports out of China indicating they're working on a new anti-ship missile that's probably several years away from being operational, called the DF-26, which will reach out about 3,000 to 3,500 kilometers. And that's represented by the small dotted line. And you can see it reaches out past the second island chain. And the idea is any threat that tries to approach China has to immediately be aware of those missiles as they enter those areas that China wants to deny them in time of crisis or war.
So what is causing China to focus so much on the sea versus other parts of the country?
Well, much of it's their view of how threats have changed. Since the revolution and the People's Republic of China's foundation, they had a brief period of conflict with the Soviet Union, so they had several border clashes. But since then, their intrinsic military powers reached a point where they feel secure on the landward side. Plus, they have a diplomatic initiative underway to negotiate border agreements with the countries that they have contentious issues with. India, for example, Russia returned about 12 square kilometers of territory back to China just last week, territory they took from them in the 1840s. And so their view is, we've taken care of the land threat, but in the 19th century, a threat we never considered came in and destroyed our culture as it was at that time. It triggered what they call the century of humiliation. A second element to making them focus on the sea is they now have a global economy. And they have their goods going out to the entire world, and they're bringing in raw materials and goods from the world. And most of that is coming by way of the sea. So they have a need to both protect their territory from a seaward threat, but also protect their trade at sea.
This is really great to know because, traditionally, if you look in Chinese history, it's, all the threats did come from land. Mm-hmm. But, where you look at wealth and what's important to the Chinese now, it's not the amount of, of course, their territorial borders, mm-hmm. The geographic territorial borders are very important to them. but where most of their wealth is coming from is from the sea, is from trade. 80% of their country's wealth is on the border directly. And a lot of what's happening in the East is, in their West is, it's desert, it's mountain ranges. There's not a lot of minerals, and it's not like resources they can really get from it that they're so concerned about. Of course, if anyone tried to take any of that land, that would be worrisome to them, but most of the countries surrounding them are very distracted by other conflicts.
And plus they're also dependent upon China for much of their economic well-being. And so China's view is the near threat is contained. The distant threat is now a concern. And if you look at their trade routes on the map, for example, the thicker the red area, the higher the density of shipping. And if you look at the circles, that's where pirate activity is noted. You have piracy off the west coast of Africa. Most of it's generated of what we call the coastal variety, where they go aboard a ship, rob the crew, steal goods. Very rare that they hijack the ship, but sometimes they do so they can steal the cargo and sell it elsewhere. The Western Indian Ocean is, of course, off the coast of East Africa, has gotten the most publicity over the last 6 years. And European Union, and indeed Europe, is China's #1 market now. The United States is #2. And so that choke point there, as you go through, you'll see 3 of them. There's the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, there's the Suez Canal, and then there's Gibraltar. So they feel a need to protect their maritime trade, and the Navy was pressured into joining the UN anti-piracy effort. The other thing, too, of course, is the piracy in the Malacca Straits, which China's not directly involved in, and for very good reasons. One of the reasons they don't get directly involved is they know they're perceived as an outside power there. And so since the local authorities, and there's no UN mandate, local authorities within a commission under ASEAN is prosecuting the piracy there. And so what you're looking at is a drive for the Navy to become a broad global oceanic force. And these trade routes give you a very good idea as to why.
So how is China projecting their power, and how are they addressing these larger global threats? Because these are very, if you look at Chinese history, this is not something that they've addressed in the past. I mean, generally, they're very concerned about their own borders, they're concerned about their own trade, but they don't like being dependent on anybody else. They don't like feeling like they're not the most powerful, because traditionally they were always the most powerful of all the nations surrounding them. So how are they responding?
There's 2 elements to it. One thing that has changed, and they're just now wrestling with it politically and psychologically, and that is they have about 5 million citizens living and working outside China. And the majority of them are in regions of the world where, shall we say, stability is not guaranteed. They're looking at, for example, Yemen, they had several thousand people working and living there. They had to pull them out. They had over 40,000 people in Libya that they had to pull out of. They have almost 1.2 million people spread out across Africa. And so they now have to concern themselves with getting their citizens out of danger in areas where they traditionally felt non-interference. We will not interfere with local affairs. It's purely a national sovereignty issue for that country where their citizens are located. And they're finding that that policy doesn't always work well for the protection of their citizens. And there's domestic pressure within China, and the party's very responsive to it. Why are you not protecting Chinese? And while that's not a major political movement, it is a political concern, and the party's trying to preempt it becoming a major problem. And so they've done at least 5 evacuations that I know of: Kenya, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon. Their first major evacuation was out of Lebanon in 2006. And now they're looking at the Navy being the forward deployed force that would respond first to rescuing citizens from a bad situation. And the Navy's done a very good job of publicizing their effort. A group of Chinese citizens were kidnapped about a year ago, and they were released about 7 months ago. They were flown back to China, but the Navy made a big publicity effort to show that they were treated at a Navy hospital, They were first treated by Navy doctors from a Navy ship. And so the impression given to the Chinese people is the Navy was intimately involved in it. And they may have been on one level or another, but certainly in the final moments they were.
You know, and this is for a country that doesn't have a traditionally very developed Navy. And as well, we have to remember that the Navy and all parts of their security forces, those are part of the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Party. They are not meant to protect, and they're first and foremost has to protect the Communist Party, not the people of China. So, So this is saying that China sees its own citizens out in other countries as an extension of something that they need to protect.
Indeed.
Whether or not they're part of the Communist Party, because this is something that they see. There's a lot of ingrained interests all over the world.
And the mindset is the party's legitimacy is based on its promise to take care of the people. That's why their military doctrine's number one requirement, protect the party. But the number two is to assist the economy. And so you can look at the protection of citizens overseas as fulfilling both of those requirements. By providing a legitimate government means of protecting the people, they ensure China's continued presence in the global market in that area, or in the regional market in that area, and you're sustaining the legitimacy of the party as a protector of the people.
And very important to note that there are a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises,
Indeed.
which directly fund a lot of activities of the Communist Party that are active all over the world. I mean, especially in Africa. And becoming active in the Middle East, South America.
Indeed, commercial Chinese operations and companies very often have an element of government ownership. It's not always the case, but in most cases, there's at least some portion of government control and ownership in there. And so, once again, that gets back to the issue of protecting the economy and protecting the people, protecting the party, the legitimacy of the party, etc. So they're all kind of extensions of the same basic mission requirements under their doctrine.
So let's go back and talk a little more in detail about these missions where they did do these rescues. I mean, this is the first time, and the first couple times you do anything, it's not perfect. I mean,
Indeed.
the U.S. has a lot of U.S., British, European navies have a lot more experience working around the world. So what did the Chinese learn from these exercises, these evacuations? What are they doing as a result?
Well, Lebanon was the first one, and they wound up doing it entirely by chartering aircraft, and it didn't go smoothly. They eventually got their citizens out, but it raised the question is, what if we had not been able to charter aircraft? Why are we chartering foreign airlines to haul our citizens out? And why did, I think it was 126 of them, 126 of our citizens had to go on ferries chartered by, I believe it was either the United States or Britain, back to Cyprus. You know, it gets back to your point. We don't need outside help. But the Navy wasn't there and couldn't participate. And then you look at Yemen, the Navy was involved, but they could only take 200 or 300 at a time. So they chartered a ferry, and the Navy made 4 trips to bring their people out of Yemen. Libya, however, was the big case. 40,000 citizens had to be brought out. Over half of them went in ferries that were chartered by the Italians or another European country. The Navy was there. They had a frigate there to kind of oversee the operation, to show the the Chinese presence. And the frigate took out about 400 people, but it had to be done over a period of days because of the numbers and the fact they didn't have any kind of major amphibious lift or anything to go there. And so air charters plus ferries were the primary means. And so that has increased a desire for them to have a forward deployed capability. In fact, it was being discussed until a few months ago in Chinese publications, to bring people out in an emergency. The need to protect their citizens overseas has become a visible issue over the last 3 years as a result of those evacuations. And so you're seeing a kind of a naval buildup and modernization that contains that element. I think the impetus to be a broad ocean force accelerated as a result of that. Also, the Navy's diplomatic mission has expanded because of the tsunami, where they weren't able to provide the assistance that other countries did.
Let's stop at that note.
Okay.
We're going to a commercial break quickly. We'll see you back in a minute. Again, we are on Twitter at ThinkTech HI. See you soon.
Hi, I'm from ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Carlos Juarez, host of Global Connections, and I want to invite you to come join us. We cover a range of global issues. We bring a lot of expert opinion, a lot of issues, whether they're contemporary events happening in the world or maybe looking at things from a more historical perspective. Global issues, very important for us to understand in this globally interconnected world. Join us here on Global Connections.
Aloha, welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster right before Veterans Day, and we are talking about a very interesting topic, China's Navy, which is really in the news a lot over the past few years. I mean, whether or not, we say specifically China's Navy, I mean, we're talking about the South China Sea, and right before the commercial break, we were talking about the rescue operation in the Philippines, which is a kind of famous story that I think is interesting to discuss very briefly. So can we talk about what happened there?
Well, yeah, the typhoon that went through the southern Philippines and devastated a major swath of territory across the central Philippines. For the first time, and it happened right after China and the Philippines had some tensions in the Spratly Islands around Mischief Reef and Fury Cross Reef. And so the Chinese had a difficult decision. They wanted to help, and they sent their hospital ship eventually, and provided medical assistance and humanitarian assistance to that effort. And it was the first major disaster response by the PLA Navy. About $8 to $10 million worth of assistance provided, plus they treated somewhere on the order of about 3,000 to 4,000 people for various medical ailments and things. And so in Chinese eyes, that demonstrated the diplomatic side of what a Navy can do. We call it soft power.
Right.
Navies have always had a diplomatic role, show the flag, show presence. Most embassies traditionally were delivered by ship, and most diplomatic communications was handled by navies in the past. And so there's a kind of and the Chinese are aware of that.
Right.
They traditionally have delivered their embassies by sea, although that's not done in the 20th century.
However, though this gesture of goodwill was construed by the mainstream media and by the Philippines negatively.
To a great extent. Much of the Philippine media doesn't trust the Chinese, and they were wondering, what's the hidden agenda here? So they question and distrust most actions the Chinese make of a positive nature towards the Philippines, because they see it in the context of what they perceive as Chinese aggression in the Spratly Islands. And the result is you have this dichotomy where the government wants strong action taken on the international level to contain the Chinese, but at the same time, the Philippines and China have a fairly dynamic economic relationship, so the government's kind of trying to walk a tightrope, but the people don't trust China. They see them as another powerful country trying to squeeze them into a corner.
And something the Chinese and other countries as well did with their aid is they wanted to show how much aid they could give and use it as a way to grandstand, when in fact the Philippines were saying we don't need medical supplies, this is what we need, and they weren't getting what they needed. This is a huge problem in aid all over the world, where people want to give aid and they give the wrong things, and this happened, the refugee crisis in Europe now. But however, getting back to the
and part of it's Chinese inexperience. This was the first major disaster they responded to. They did respond to the Asia tsunami in 2004, but it was very limited. They simply shipped supplies and a handful of doctors. This was the first time they did it as a major operation. And they took a cookie cutter approach, which is what you do when you're in a hurry. most experienced aid responders send survey teams first and find out what's needed and then prioritize what they do in response to what the survey teams identify. Also, they work closely with the host government, because in the end, that's who's really in charge, is the host government. It's their people, their sovereignty. And the Chinese recognized that aspect of it, but they didn't recognize the need to identify what to bring first. So it was what we call a semi-victory. They won on one level. In their own minds, they won. But in reality, it may have been at least partially counterproductive.
So let's go back to what, all these lessons that the Chinese are learning. I mean, so they're developing their abilities to respond to disasters. They're developing their abilities to respond to evacuating their citizens. So what are they developing now? What are the big changes? What are the big exciting things that are happening?
On one level, they're preparing their Navy for broad ocean operations. For example, they commissioned their first aircraft carrier back in 2012. It's essentially a modified Soviet Kuznetsov class carrier. The difference between the Chinese carrier and the old Soviet carrier is the Chinese removed all of the long-range anti-ship missiles. And so it's purely an aircraft carrier. The aircraft provided its primary striking power and its primary air defense capabilities. The Chinese are using this carrier, which they call the Liaoning, named after a province, primarily as a platform for testing doctrine, tactics, and procedures for integrating an aircraft carrier into the fleet. There are two more under construction. And what they're learning is what, of course, the United States learned many years ago, and that is building a carrier is one thing, but it reflects and requires the very highest integration of all aspects of your maritime industry and force. You have to integrate naval technology, construction technology, and electronics with aviation technology in order to build a carrier that can handle airplanes effectively. And then you have to integrate an air wing crew and the ship's crew, and then you have to integrate the carrier into a task group, and then you have to integrate the task group into your joint force structure or your maritime force structure. And so it's very complex. It's a 4-level development system, and they're currently at about the 3rd stage of that development with the Liaoning. And they should have it done by the time the other carriers are built. And what this chart shows, this is my estimate of what the Chinese must go through to build their 3 carriers. You will notice, for example, they've begun to build carrier aircraft. The second carrier, which began construction probably about 14 months ago, will finish sometime around, be launched and commissioned sometime between 2018, 2019. And then you'll see it starting its sea trials and workups. The airplane development, however, is also important. The J-15, the Chinese media suggests some disappointment with it. They're also talking about adding an aircraft launching system, which adds a level of complexity to the ship's construction, but it gives you advantages with the capabilities of the aircraft. They're looking at either an electromagnetic aircraft launching system, which is a much higher technology, but once it's added to the ship, it's easier to maintain, and it's not as size and weight and nor as mechanically complex as a steam system, which is the traditional catapult system for ships. And then, of course, what other planes do you build? An aircraft carrier operating far from shore has to have an airborne warning and control system aircraft. We have the E-2. You cannot launch that type of aircraft off a ski ramp because the power to weight ratio isn't sufficient. You need a catapult. Same thing with tanker aircraft. The Chinese have to use what they call buddy stores, where you take a tactical aircraft and he carries an additional fuel tank that he gives to the other aircraft. But that means that aircraft doesn't carry weapons or bombs, or at least a very limited number. So they're going to need to develop tankers. They're going to need to develop a sea-based maritime patrol aircraft. And they're going to have to develop some kind of AWACS.
Well, they're also going to have to develop people.
Indeed.
Because, I mean, can you compare, how large is an aircraft carrier's runway versus a
It's
traditional
significantly
runway?
less. A typical high-performance jet aircraft uses about 6,000 to 8,000 feet of runway to take off. On a carrier, you have about 500. And so you have one of two trade-offs. If you have a ski ramp, then you cut the amount of weight. For example, the maximum weight of a J-15 is supposedly around 52,000 pounds. But for a ski ramp takeoff, about 40 to 44,000 pounds is probably the most you can get away with, because you have to have a thrust to weight ratio exceeding 1 to 1. Well, what do you download? Fuel or ordnance?
Right.
And so that's the disadvantage of a ski ramp. But if you have a catapult that can take that plane from 0 to 140 knots in about 200 feet, then you can have that plane be fully loaded.
So you have to train, I mean, not only do they have to develop the technology, figure out how to use the technology, they have to train people to use the technology to operate symbiotically within the ship, within the aircraft carrier. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done between today and the moment where this becomes fully operational.
Well, indeed, the air wing crew and the ship's crew have to be completely integrated. Picture a 2,000-man football team, and you're trying to run an offense. Everyone has to do their part, and it's dangerous on that flight deck if you get it wrong. Hooking the plane up to the catapult launching system quickly and efficiently, and then getting out of the way before that plane launches, that is kind of like, it's very much like an offensive football play. Linemen have to be out of the way, wide receivers have to do their thing, and if you get it wrong, people can be killed. Most people don't realize how dangerous a carrier flight deck can be. If you get too close to the jet aircraft inlet, you can be sucked into the engine. The results are not pleasant, typically fatal. And so very often, as we learned during the Vietnam War and some of the elements of the Cold War, if you rush the training and send people early, you pay for it down the road. I was on a carrier that was surged in the late 70s, and we lost 6 people to flight deck problems in the first 3 or 4 weeks we were deployed. Now, once everyone was a smooth machine, the accidents dropped. But it's better to take a patient approach and build that capability, which is what the Chinese are trying to do, than it is to rush. So once they get a catapult system, their problem's not solved. You've hit the nail on the head. The catapult system is a technological challenge, but once it's on the ship and you're launching aircraft, you've not only got to design the aircraft to handle the G-forces of a launch and recovery at a heavier weight, you've also got to train the human beings to hook it up, get it in place, hook it up, get out of the way, and launch quickly and safely. It's a 5-stage process once again. And in a Navy that uses 2-year conscripts, that's going to be quite a challenge.
And, you know, especially when you look at the United States, I mean, how long have we been using aircraft carriers?
Since 1928.
So we've had quite a while to figure out how to develop, manage the technology and the people. And in addition to this, we've had actively operational forces in the Persian Gulf for, should I say, about 35 years?
Yes, ma'am.
So, I mean, when you have, and those are places and problems that the Chinese are going to have to address.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, as the U.S. draws down in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, as our reliance on oil decreases, as we start looking more inward, the Chinese are going to have to come in and fill these gaps, because otherwise...
Otherwise, they don't fulfill the mission of protecting their own interests.
Right. Well, who's going to protect their fuel tankers coming from the Persian Gulf? I mean, especially, you know, Iran, the embargoes on Iran start lowering. Countries can build up their amount they're exporting. At the same time, extremism is growing in Yemen and in other places. So this is part of the way they need to be addressing these global problems.
And I think that struggle, that policy philosophical struggle is underway behind the scenes. Because one of the things they're doing, of course, is they're diversifying where they get their supplies from. But they can't escape the Persian Gulf right now in terms of oil supplies, because they still import 50% from there. But they're trying to diversify their sources and their means. But they're also expanding their Navy in ways to where if they suddenly desire to intervene, they'll have a better capability to do so. But that philosophical discussion, if it's underway, it's only just now begun.
At that point, we're going to cut to a quick commercial break. I'm Hillary Weinberg at The Whole Gamut. Get us on Twitter at ThinkTech HI. See you in a minute.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Keith.
My name's Keith Bettinger.
I knew that.
And I'm the host of ThinkTech Asia.
I knew that too.
Here on ThinkTech.
Fabulous. You got a great show going, Keith.
Thank you very much. And for our viewers out there that are interested in ThinkTech Asia, it airs every Tuesday from 4 to 4:45. And it can be accessed online at revered.com.
Yeah, so what kind of guests you like?
Well, we have a number of guests from academia, practitioners of international affairs. Sometimes we have military officials. Sometimes we have public officials on the show. And our goal, we try to talk about current issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia, all throughout the Asian realm in more depth than you would find in traditional mainstream
That's the
media.
difference, isn't it?
Exactly.
That you're reaching out beyond what ordinary news media would do.
Right.
And that's why we like you so much.
We're trying to provide a thinking person's perspective, an intelligent perspective on what's going on, and we're both sides of the story, or even when there's more than two sides, we try to cover every angle. And I think that's one of the big benefits that we provide here at ThinkTech, is it's a really innovative source of educational programming for the people of Hawaii.
You're great, Keith. You are a great host. You got a great show going on. I watch it every week.
Thanks very much.
Why don't
Jay.
you guys watch it every week too, okay?
4:45 to 4 to 4:45 every Tuesday.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg. This is The Whole Gamut, and I'm here with retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster. We've been talking about China's Navy, and we have a lot to talk about still, and this is a really exciting, important topic that doesn't get a lot of detail. So let's go back in. Let's jump back in.
Okay, first thing we'll do is, let me show you how they're operating on the world's ocean. If we open up with the map here, this shows wherever you see a Chinese flag, that is where they've done port visits. They have expanded their visible footprint in the world significantly since 2001. Prior to 2001, you saw a handful of port visits limited to Asia. 2001 was the first time they went outside. 2003, they did a round-the-world cruise, visiting 23 countries. And now, if you look at where they're visiting today, just within West Asia and the Indian Ocean, they visit around 18 countries. And if you see the little symbols of the weightlifter, they look like white squares here on the map. There should be 4 of them. That is where they've done bilateral naval exercises, where they work with the local Navy and generate personal relationships and professional relationships and grow accustomed to working with each other.
Is that Bangladesh?
Indeed, yep.
Wow, that's an interesting one. It's not one I expected.
They have a small Navy that most people don't know much about because they don't go far, and they don't have a lot of money, so they don't operate much. And most of their Navy is for close-in operations. The Chinese have worked with them. They generally visit Chittagong. And if you'll notice the blue circles there in the Western Indian Ocean, that's where the anti-piracy operations are being conducted. You'll notice they've done port visits in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines. They've even gone out as far as Micronesia.
And a lot in East Africa.
Absolutely. And their hospital ship, every other year, goes out and goes down the east coast of Africa, providing medical assistance to those countries. Typically treats around 3,000 to 4,000 patients each port visit. And then you'll notice the port visits in the Red Sea. The Chinese have actually had a small number of ships operate in the Mediterranean sporadically. They've expanded their operations to Europe over the last 4 years. If we could go to the next map, you'll see that. And once again, you'll see here port visits in Russia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Spain, Portugal. Portugal, not Spain, Italy, and Croatia, Britain, Germany, Denmark, Belgium, and of course the Baltic, Finland and Sweden, and Poland. And the same ship that did the visit there in Poland, shown on the map, just completed its visit to Mayport, Florida, where it did a bilateral exercise with some U.S. Navy ships in Mayport, Florida, just outside Jacksonville.
Other than a great vacation, this is a huge ramp up from nothing about 2 decades ago.
Yes, ma'am.
To, visiting most of the major countries and major navies in Europe. Turkey has one of the top 5 navies, so does Great Britain, and so in the world. And so they're really developing their bilateral capabilities as well as their ability to be in different types of waters, in different locations, work with different cultures. And these are huge steps that the Chinese Navy is taking.
Exactly. And if you can see the exercise symbol there in the middle of the med, they did a bilateral exercise with Russia in May, becoming the first Asian nation to conduct naval operations with another country in the Mediterranean since the First World War. The Japanese were there in the First World War. And so, once again, you're looking at a major expansion, including, by the way, as the next map will show you, they've done fleet exercises with the small navy of Namibia in Southwest Africa, and you'll notice they've done port visits in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Panama, Grenada, which I couldn't fit on the map, and they're probably going to be doing a port visit here in Cuba sometime next week. If not by the end of this week, then they'll go to Venezuela and then through the canal and start their way home. So this is an ocean-going navy. And one of the things that will come out of this is they're learning all kinds of logistics lessons. Supporting a carrier locally requires 4 to 8 times the fuel and other elements, spare parts and logistics support of a small task group of frigates and destroyers. And operating this far from home, you're looking at moving several thousand tons of oil per week, or purchasing it, to support your fleet operations in that area, even for a small task group. So multiply that by 10 if a carrier task group comes out. So one of the lessons learned from this last 7 years of ocean-going operations is they're now building larger logistics support ships. They're going to probably have what we call a fleet train, probably by 2020, and it'll be about 6 or 8 large-scale oiler, or what's known as a comprehensive logistics support ship. It'll have spare parts, ordnance, and oil on it, something that can operate with the fleet.
Wow, this is a lot. I mean, and these are countries that we wouldn't necessarily imagine doing exercises and port visits with. But I mean, you look at Southwest Africa. I mean, there's a lot of oil coming from the western coast of Africa. You look at South America, other than some former communist nations and the obvious of the Panama Canal. I mean, Chile considers itself a Pacific nation. It is a Pacific nation. It has stake in the ability of free trade in the Pacific Ocean. Argentina and Brazil, those are, I mean, really big superpower, in South America. I mean, China, not only is it, developing itself, it's not ignoring some of the smaller countries that will be useful. Indeed. In the future.
And in some cases, take South Africa, for example, down there in the lower right-hand corner. They have a very extensive economic relationship with South Africa. From an investment perspective, they're treating it as an industrial hub for the lowest part of Africa. And their interactions with the South African Navy has paid off politically. For example, 80 South African midshipmen are going to be receiving their training in China over the next 5 years. That's quite a change. Traditionally, South Africa's midshipmen and military cadets get their training in India. And so this is the first time that they will receive their training and education from a non-Indian, non-Commonwealth country. So that's a major development. Although we think of it as small scale, it's a significant first step.
Yeah, this is so fascinating, and we could do an entire show just talking about any one of these maps, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up. We have 5 minutes left, so let's talk about, what are the things that you'd really like to highlight, and where do you see China's Navy going?
Well, first of all, the Navy is only one of 4 elements of China's maritime power. The others are, of course, the Merchant Marine, which is, if you include Hong Kong as a Chinese flag merchant ship, second largest in the world. The third is their Coast Guard. Their Coast Guard has right now 220 ocean-going units, making it the largest Coast Guard in Southeast Asia.
Which has been very active in the South China Sea, and the cause and participants in some controversial moments.
They're the most visible element of China's effort to push its interest in the Spratly Islands and South China Sea. And it's growing. They've got about 15 vessels under construction, and their Coast Guard is larger than most of the regional navies that surround the South China Sea. The third element is, of course, their Marine Corps. They have a 10,000-man Marine Corps, and they are expanding their amphibious capability. They have 67 ocean-going amphibious ships. They have a couple of what we would call amphibious helicopter carriers or dock helicopter landing ships, LHDs, under construction. They'll probably be entering service over the next 5 years, starting sometime around 2017. There's also something that doesn't get a lot of publicity, and that is they have a maritime militia, People's Maritime Militia, which is 1,000 fishing craft that can be called up to support government action. They have been most lately used in the South China Sea. They're the group blockading the Philippine naval vessel that was run aground off Mischief Reef to ensure that Philippines had a presence there. And here's the game these People's Militia play. They were the ships that harassed some Navy ships, U.S. Navy ships 5 years ago. Since they're considered civilian, what do you do to them? If you attack them to drive them off, do something physical, you're attacking innocent civilians. Typically, only Coast Guards are allowed to interfere with civilian craft. And so it sets you up for what we would call a strategic communications or PR failure to mess with these guys. Worst case, in wartime, they can be used to lay mines, barriers, and they also can act as the eyes of the fleet. And they report to a People's Armed Forces Department headquarters near where they're operating. Most of those you see in the South China Sea, for example, report to the Armed Forces Defense Department headquarters in Sanya, Hainan Island. And Sanya also happens to be, it's not only a major fishing village, but just around the corner is a growing naval base. So those elements of maritime power are significant, and you'll notice we tend to ignore 3 of them.
There's a lot going on.
Yes, ma'am.
And there's so much to talk about. And unfortunately, last few minutes. So like, what do we see? I mean, from what you've been saying, it sounds like China's Navy is going to ramp up in power, ability, power projection, and even just technology and expertise. They really are doing a lot of what they need to be doing to build up. I mean, so it sounds like, in the future, China's Navy will be a force to be reckoned with.
Indeed. Most of the growth will occur after 2020. It's my belief that between 2022 and 2025, you'll see one of their carriers in the Indian Ocean. And sometime at that time frame or after, they may even have the carrier go up into the Mediterranean and make some port visits, because aircraft carriers are impressive and it shows them to be a world power. So you're going to see a great deal of Chinese naval activity on the world's oceans over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming back.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And come back, tune in December 8th, I think it is. We're going to be talking about a little bit about Pearl Harbor Day and some history surrounding it. So, again, I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and this has been The Whole Gamut.